At 0742 on the morning of March 6, 1944, Colonel Donald Blakeslee sat in the cockpit of a P-51B Mustang at Debden Airfield in England, preparing to lead a mission that the Luftwaffe thought was impossible. The mission was Berlin, 560 miles into the heart of Nazi Germany. The German High Command had been told repeatedly by their intelligence officers that no American single-engine fighter had the range to reach Berlin and return. The round trip was 1,100 miles. Every fighter the Americans had tried, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, ran out of fuel hundreds of miles before reaching the capital. German pilots knew this. They waited beyond fighter range, then tore into the unescorted bombers. American bomber losses over Germany had become unsustainable. In October 1943, 60 B-17 Flying Fortresses were shot down in a single mission to Schweinfurt, 20% of the attacking force. The daylight bombing campaign was failing, but on this morning, Blakeslee's P-51 had something the Germans didn't believe existed. Under each wing hung a 108-gallon drop tank, paper tanks manufactured in Britain, filled with fuel that would give his Mustang a combat radius of 850 miles. Combined with the internal 85-gallon fuselage tank and wing tanks, the P-51 carried enough fuel to fly to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes, and come home. The Luftwaffe High Command had declared this impossible. Their calculations said American fighters lacked the range. Their intelligence reports confirmed it. Their pilots had been briefed that they would never see enemy fighters over Berlin. They were wrong. Blakeslee was 26 years old. He had been fighting Germans since 1941, first with the Royal Air Force's Eagle Squadron, then with the United States Army Air Force's 4th Fighter Group. He had flown over 500 combat missions, more than any American pilot in the war. He knew the cost of unescorted bomber raids. He had watched too many B-17s go down in flames because fighters had to turn back due to fuel limitations. Now, for the first time, he was about to take single-engine fighters all the way to the Nazi capital. What happened in the next 7 hours would change the strategic balance of the air war over Europe. The first bomber crew, the 4th Fighter Group, lost to lack of fighter escort, was Lieutenant Robert Harriman's B-17 crew on August 17, 1943. Harriman had been in England for 2 months. His crew had flown 6 missions over occupied Europe. Their target that day was the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. The P-47s escorted them to the German border, then turned back. They didn't have enough fuel to go farther. The Luftwaffe waited. They knew exactly when the American fighters would leave. They had been tracking escort range for months. German fighter controllers watched the P-47s turn west, then ordered their pilots to attack. Over 300 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s swarmed the bomber formations. Harriman's B-17 took cannon fire in the No. 3 engine 20 minutes after the escorts left. The engine caught fire. The pilot feathered the propeller but couldn't extinguish the flames. 2 more German fighters came in from 6 o'clock, walked cannon shells through the fuselage. The tail section broke away. The bomber fell out of formation, spinning toward Earth. 3 crew members got out. 7 didn't. The mission lost 36 bombers. 260 men killed or captured, all beyond fighter escort range. The second crew was Captain James O'Connor's B-24, lost September 6 near Stuttgart. O'Connor was a flight leader, experienced, with 14 missions completed. His formation attacked the Taube Day, Bosch magneto plant. The P-38s escorted them as far as their fuel allowed, roughly 400 miles from England. Then they turned back. The Luftwaffe hit the formation 30 seconds later. O'Connor's crew reported on the radio that they were under attack from 15 to 20 fighters. They called for help. No fighters were available. They were alone, 150 miles inside Germany, 40 bombers against 300 German interceptors. O'Connor's aircraft took multiple 20mm cannon hits. The right-wing fuel tank exploded. The bomber rolled, inverted, and dove straight down from 22,000 feet. No parachutes were seen. 10 men dead. By October 1943, the 8th Air Force had lost 194 heavy bombers in 3 months. Most were shot down after fighter escorts had to return to base due to fuel limitations. The crews called it going naked, flying without fighter cover. German pilots called it happy hunting. In time, they knew exactly where American escort range ended. They positioned their fighters just beyond that point and waited. When the American escorts turned back, the Germans attacked in overwhelming numbers. The bombers tried to defend themselves with their .50 caliber machine guns, but a B-17's defensive fire couldn't stop a determined Luftwaffe pilot making a head-on attack at 400 miles per hour. The bomber crews were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The situation was unsustainable. The worst loss was the second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943. 320 heavy bombers attacked the ball-bearing factories. 60 were shot down. 600 men killed or captured in a single day. Another 17 bombers were damaged beyond repair. Another 100 were damaged and required extensive repairs. The total loss rate was 29%. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, ordered a pause in deep penetration missions. The losses were too high. The bomber crews were exhausted. The replacement pilots were arriving with inadequate training and being killed on their first or second missions. Something had to change. Without long-range fighter escort, the daylight bombing campaign couldn't continue. Without the daylight bombing campaign, the planned invasion of Europe might fail. The Germans would have time to reinforce their defences, to build more weapons, to train more pilots. The war could drag on for years. More American soldiers would die on the beaches of France if the Luftwaffe wasn't destroyed first. The problem wasn't that the bombers couldn't reach their targets. B-17s and B-24s had the range to strike anywhere in Germany. The problem was they couldn't survive the German fighters without escort. And no American fighter had the range to escort them all the way to the target and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt had a combat radius of roughly 230 miles with internal fuel, extended to about 375 miles with drop tanks. That was enough to escort bombers to targets in Western Germany, but not to Berlin, not to the Ruhr industrial region, not to the critical oil refineries and aircraft factories deep inside the Reich. The P-38 Lightning had better range, roughly 450 miles combat radius, but the aircraft suffered serious problems in the cold temperatures at high altitude over Europe. The turbocharger systems failed regularly. The pilots called it getting P-38'd, when both engines quit simultaneously at 30,000 feet. The Lightning was also in short supply. There were never enough P-38s to provide adequate escort coverage. The Spitfire, flown by the Royal Air Force, had excellent performance but insufficient range, even with drop tanks. It could barely reach Paris. The bomber crews were paying the price. They flew missions knowing that for large portions of the flight, they would be unescorted, vulnerable. They watched German fighters position themselves at the limit of American escort range, waiting. The bomber crews could see them up there, circling like sharks, counting down the minutes until the American fighters had to leave. Then the attacks would begin, wave after wave, German fighters diving through the formations, firing 20mm cannons and 30mm guns, ripping apart the unarmored bombers, killing the crews. A bomber could absorb incredible punishment and still fly, but enough hits would bring anything down. The German pilots knew where to aim: the cockpit, the engines, the wing fuel tanks. They had been killing bombers for 2 years. They were very good at it. On December 20th, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group arrived in England with a new aircraft, the P-51B Mustang. The Mustang's development had been rushed and unconventional. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation, asking them to build P-40 Warhawks under license. North American's president, James Kindleberger, made a counteroffer. His company could design and build a completely new fighter in the same time frame. The British agreed, skeptical but desperate for aircraft. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, led a team that designed the complete aircraft in 117 days. The prototype flew in October 1940. It was designated NA-73 by the company, Mustang by the British. The early Mustangs used Allison engines and were relegated to low-altitude tactical reconnaissance. They had superb handling characteristics and exceptional range, but the Allison engine's performance fell off dramatically above 15,000 feet. They couldn't compete with German fighters at the altitudes where bombers operated, 20,000 to 30,000 feet where the air was thin, and turbochargers were essential. The Royal Air Force used them for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance, roles where low-altitude performance mattered more than high-altitude capability. Then, someone had an idea. Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang in April 1942 and immediately recognized its potential. The airframe was excellent, the aerodynamics were superb, but the engine was wrong. Harker wrote a report suggesting that if the Allison engine was replaced with a Rolls-Royce Merlin, the aircraft would have outstanding high-altitude performance. The Merlin 61 engine had a two-stage supercharger that maintained power output up to 30,000 feet and beyond. Combined with the Mustang's clean aerodynamic design and large fuel capacity, a Merlin-powered Mustang might be the long-range, high-altitude fighter everyone needed. The British took the suggestion seriously. They shipped 5 Mustang airframes to Rolls-Royce for conversion. The 5 results exceeded expectations. With the Merlin engine, the Mustang's top speed increased from 365 miles per hour to 441 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Climb rate improved dramatically. Service ceiling increased from 31,000 feet to 42,000 feet. The aircraft transformed from a capable low-altitude fighter into an exceptional high-altitude interceptor. North American began production of Merlin-powered Mustangs in 1943, designated P-51B and P-51C models. The engine was built under license by Packard in America, designated V1657. The airframe remained essentially unchanged from the original design. The fuel capacity was extraordinary for a single-engine fighter. Internal fuel capacity was 84 gallons in the wing tanks initially, increased to 184 gallons when an 85-gallon fuselage tank was added behind the pilot during production. With 2 108-gallon drop tanks, total fuel capacity reached 400 gallons. The P-51B could fly at 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It could climb to 30,000 feet in under 8 minutes. It could turn with a BF-109, dive with a FRO-190, and most importantly, it could carry enough fuel to fly for over 6 hours. With internal fuel only, the P-51B had a combat radius of roughly 475 miles. But with 2 108-gallon drop tanks, the radius extended to 850 miles. That was enough. That was finally enough to reach Berlin, but there was a problem with the extra fuel. The P-51B's fuselage tank was located behind the pilot, aft of the center of gravity. When fully loaded with 85 gallons, the aircraft became dangerously unstable in pitch. Test pilots reported that with a full fuselage tank, violent pullouts or hard turns caused the control stick loads to reverse, meaning the pilot had to push forward on the stick to prevent the nose from pitching up further. The aircraft wanted to tumble. With a full fuselage tank, a P-51B couldn't dogfight. It could barely maneuver. The solution was to burn the fuselage tank fuel first, before entering combat. Pilots were instructed to use the fuselage tank during climb-out and cruise, keeping the aircraft stable by the time they reached enemy territory. Once the fuselage tank was empty or nearly empty, the center of gravity shifted forward and the aircraft handled normally, but that meant careful fuel management. Pilots had to monitor fuel consumption constantly, switching tanks at the right moments, calculating range to target, time to fight, fuel required for the return trip. One mistake, and they would run out of fuel over Germany. The 354th Fighter Group flew its first escort mission with the P-51 on December 5, 1943. They escorted bombers to Amiens, France, then to Emden on December 11th, then to Kiel on December 13th. The Kiel mission reached 480 miles into Germany, the deepest penetration by American single-engine fighters up to that date. The Luftwaffe responded. They sent up over 200 fighters to intercept. The 354th shot down 8 German aircraft and lost none of their own. The P-51 worked. It could fly deep into Germany, fight, and come home. Major General James Doolittle, who had just taken command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, saw the potential immediately. He needed that aircraft. He needed hundreds of them. The strategic bombing campaign's success depended on destroying the Luftwaffe's fighter force. The only way to do that was to force them into combat where American fighters could kill them. And the only way to force them into combat was to attack targets the Germans had to defend, targets deep inside Germany, targets like Berlin. But to attack Berlin, he needed long-range fighters. He needed P-51's. Doolittle began converting fighter groups from P-47's to P-51's as quickly as aircraft became available. The 4th Fighter Group was next. Colonel Donald Blakeslee, who had been assigned to the 354th in December to help them transition to combat operations, returned to the 4th in January as the new group commander. He wanted his group equipped with Mustangs. He pushed hard. Major General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command, was reluctant. Converting a fighter group to a new aircraft type required taking the entire group off operations for weeks, while pilots and ground crews learned the new systems. Kepner couldn't afford to lose a complete fighter group during the build-up to the planned invasion of France. Blakeslee made him an offer. "Give me the P-51's, and I'll have the 4th Fighter Group operational within 24 hours. Kepner thought it was impossible. Blakeslee's pilots had been flying P-47's for over a year. They had no time in the P-51. The ground crews had no experience maintaining the Merlin engine. 24 hours wasn't enough time to convert an entire fighter group, Blakeslee insisted. His pilots had flown Spitfires with the Royal Air Force before transferring to the 8th. They knew the Merlin engine. They understood the British systems. His mechanics had worked on Merlins for years. They could handle it. Kepner agreed, but with a condition. If the 4th Fighter Group wasn't fully operational within 24 hours, Blakeslee would be relieved of command. The 4th received their first P-51Bs on February 26, 1944. Blakeslee gathered his pilots and gave them their instructions. Learn to fly them on the way to the target. They would begin combat operations within 48 hours. Some pilots had less than 30 minutes of flight time in the P-51 before flying, their first mission. The mechanics worked through the night, familiarizing themselves with the new aircraft, checking systems, loading ammunition, installing drop tanks. By February 28, the 4th Fighter Group flew their first P-51 mission, escorting bombers to France. Every aircraft returned safely. Blakeslee had kept his promise. By early March 1944, the 8th Air Force had enough P-51's to attempt what had been impossible 6 months earlier, a daylight bombing raid on Berlin with fighter escort all the way to the target and back. The operation was approved. The mission was scheduled for March 3rd. The weather scrubbed it. They tried again on March 4th. The weather was marginal but acceptable. Over 600 bombers took off, escorted by over 650 fighters, including the 4th Fighter Group's P-51's. It was the first large-scale American attack on Berlin. Blakeslee led his 48 Mustangs into the mission, briefing at 0500 hours. The map showed the route. Northeast across the North Sea, over the Netherlands, across northern Germany, straight to Berlin. The bombers would strike industrial targets in the city. The fighters would provide continuous escort from takeoff to landing. No bomber would fly unescorted. The weather forecast was for scattered clouds over the target, visibility 3 to 5 miles. German fighter opposition was expected to be heavy. The Luftwaffe would defend Berlin with everything they had. Intelligence estimated 300 to 400 German fighters would be airborne. The American fighters would be outnumbered in the target area, but they would have the advantage of altitude and position. The bombers would bomb from 24,000 to 26,000 feet. The fighters would fly top cover at 30,000 feet, positioned between the bombers and the sun, forcing any attacking German fighters to climb through the escort screen. Fuel management was critical. Pilots were instructed to burn their fuselage tanks to below 40 gallons before crossing into German territory. Drop tanks would be jettisoned when empty or when combat was imminent. Each pilot was responsible for monitoring his own fuel state and calculating his own return fuel requirements. No one would be left behind, but any pilot who ran out of fuel over Germany was on his own. The nearest friendly territory was the Netherlands, over 200 miles from Berlin. A P-51 could glide maybe 30 miles with no engine power. The math was clear. If you ran out of fuel over Berlin, you were not going home. The 4th Fighter Group took off at 0742. 48 Mustangs, each loaded with two 108-gallon drop tanks, full ammunition, and enough fuel to reach Berlin and fight. The aircraft were heavy. Taking off at maximum gross weight required careful technique. Too much throttle, and the torque would pull the aircraft off the runway. Too little, and the aircraft wouldn't accelerate fast enough to become airborne before running out of runway. Blakeslee's Mustang lifted off after using 3/4 of the runway. He climbed to 1,000 feet, circled once, and watched his 3 squadrons form up behind him. 48 aircraft in tight formation. Silver Mustangs against the grey English morning. They set course for the North Sea. The flight to Germany took 2.5 hours. The bombers were already ahead, strung out in a formation 70 miles long, over 600 heavy bombers, carrying thousands of tons of explosives toward the Nazi capital. The 4th Fighter Group rendezvoused with their assigned bomber group over the Netherlands at 0915, exactly on schedule. Blakeslee positioned his fighters in a combat spread formation 5,000 feet above the bombers, weaving back and forth to maintain position. The bombers flew straight and level, maintaining formation discipline. Below, the Dutch countryside passed by, fields and rivers and small towns. Ahead, Germany waited. They crossed the border at 0935. The first contrails appeared, high-altitude German fighters positioning for attack. Blakeslee counted at least 40, maybe 50. More appeared every minute, climbing from airfields scattered across northern Germany. The Luftwaffe had scrambled everything they had. Blakeslee called out the contacts on the radio. Bogies, 11 o'clock high, 20 plus. Bogies, 1 o'clock level, 20 plus. Bandits forming up ahead, estimate 50 plus. His pilots acknowledged. Everyone saw them. The Germans were massing for a coordinated attack. At 0958, the first German fighters dove toward the bombers. Blakeslee called out, "Here they come, break left and engage." The 4th Fighter Group turned into the attack. What followed was 7 minutes of violent aerial combat. Bf-109s and FW-190s tried to break through the escort screen. The P-51s blocked them, turning inside their attacks, firing in deflection, forcing the Germans to break off or die. Blakeslee shot at a Bf-109, but his guns jammed after 2 seconds. He continued flying anyway, positioning his aircraft to force German fighters into positions where his wingmen could shoot them. Squadron Commander Major James Goodson destroyed 2 F-190s in quick succession. Captain Don Gentile got a Bf-109 from 200 yards range, watched it explode. All across the sky, aircraft twisted and dove. Guns firing, shells hitting, aircraft smoking. The radio chatter was constant. "Break right. Bandit on your 6. Got him. 2 more at 3 o'clock. Watch the one below." Blakeslee kept his squadron together, maintained position over the bombers, denied the Germans a clear shot. The German fighters tried to get past the escorts, tried to reach the bombers, but the Mustangs blocked every approach. Finally, low on fuel and ammunition, the German fighters broke off and dove away. The 4th Fighter Group had lost none of their own and had shot down 5 confirmed German aircraft. More importantly, every bomber in their assigned group reached the target safely. Over Berlin, the sky filled with flak, thousands of German anti-aircraft guns firing upward, filling the air with exploding steel. The bombers flew through it. holding formation, opening their bomb bay doors. At 10,000 feet below, Berlin spread across the landscape, grey buildings and streets and the winding Spree River. The bombers released their bombs, thousands of bombs falling, trailing smoke, disappearing into the city below. Blakeslee watched from 30,000 feet, watched the explosions blossom across the city centre, watched the smoke rise. Berlin was burning. The bombers turned west for the return flight. More German fighters appeared, trying to attack the damaged bombers, straggling behind the formations. The P-51s stayed with them, defending, escorting, all the way across Germany, across the Netherlands, until they reached the North Sea and safety. The mission took 6 hours and 40 minutes from takeoff to landing. Blakeslee landed at Debden at 1400 hours, with 20 gallons of fuel remaining, barely enough for 10 minutes of flight. Every aircraft of the 4th Fighter Group returned. Not one bomber they escorted was shot down by German fighters. What none of the Americans realized was that on the ground in Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was watching from his headquarters. He saw the contrails of American fighters over the city. He had been told it was impossible. His intelligence officers had calculated that no American single-engine fighter had the range to reach Berlin. His engineers had examined captured P-47's and P-38's and concluded that neither aircraft could fly that far. His fighter, controllers had assured him that American bomber raids would always be vulnerable beyond escort range. They were all wrong. When Göring saw P-51's flying over Berlin escorting the bombers, he understood immediately what it meant. The strategic balance had shifted. The Americans could now bomb any target in Germany with fighter escort. There was nowhere left to hide. The Luftwaffe would have to fight over their own cities, over their own factories, over their own airfields. They would be fighting at the end of supply lines, stretched to breaking, with inadequate fuel, with poorly trained replacement pilots, against an enemy with numerical superiority and better equipment. It was, Göring later admitted, the moment he knew Germany would lose the air war. The Americans returned to Berlin on March 6th. This time, 800 bombers attacked, escorted by over 900 fighters. The 4th Fighter Group flew again. Blakeslee led them back to the capital. This time, the Luftwaffe was ready. They had pulled fighters from the Eastern Front, from Italy, from everywhere they could find them. Over 350 German fighters were airborne when the Americans arrived. The battle that followed became known as Black Monday. It was one of the largest air battles ever fought over Europe. The 4th Fighter Group encountered German fighters 50 miles from Berlin. The Luftwaffe had changed tactics. Instead of attacking the bombers directly, they focused on destroying the fighter escorts first. If they could eliminate the P-51's, the bombers would be vulnerable. Wave after wave of Bf-109s and Fuff-190s dove through the American fighter formations, trying to break them up, scatter them, eliminate the cohesive escort coverage. The American pilots fought back. Major James Goodson destroyed 2 German fighters. Lieutenant Howard Hively engaged multiple enemy aircraft. Across the entire 8th Fighter Command, American pilots fought intensely. The Luftwaffe lost between 66 and 81 aircraft according to German loss records, though American wartime claims were higher due to multiple pilots claiming the same kills. The Germans inflicted casualties too. 69 American bombers were shot down, 53 B-17s and 16 B-24s. 11 American fighters were lost, including 4 from the 4th Fighter Group. The losses were heavy, but the mission was a success. The bombers reached their targets. Berlin was bombed again. And most importantly, the presence of P-51's over Berlin was now undeniable. The Germans could no longer claim it was a mistake or a fluke. American single-engine fighters had flown to Berlin twice in 3 days. The impossible had become routine. German fighter pilots first understood the strategic implications on March 8th. 2 days after Black Monday, the 4th Fighter Group returned to Berlin, this time targeting the Erkner ball-bearing works in the city's southwest suburbs. On this mission, Captain Don Gentile and his wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, pioneered new aggressive tactics. Gentile shot down 3 Bf-109s in a single engagement, bringing his total to approximately 14 confirmed victories. Together with Godfrey, they claimed 6 enemy aircraft that day, demonstrating that P-51s could not only escort bombers to Berlin, but could dominate German fighters in combat over the Nazi capital. Gentile would eventually be credited with 19.83 aerial victories plus 6 aircraft destroyed on the ground, making him one of the war's leading aces. Luftwaffe ace Major Guenter Rull, credited with 275 victories on the Eastern Front, flew his first mission defending Berlin during this period. He encountered P-51s at 28,000 feet directly over the city. Rull was an experienced pilot, a recipient of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's most skilled fighter commanders. He knew aircraft performance, knew fuel consumption calculations, knew what should be possible and what shouldn't. When he saw P-51s over Berlin, hundreds of miles from England, he immediately understood that something fundamental had changed. After landing, he told his squadron, "The Americans have solved the range problem. They can escort their bombers anywhere now. We can't hide anymore. We'll have to fight them over every target in Germany." Other German pilots reported similar realizations. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, another experienced ace, flew against P-51s near Berlin on March 9th. He tried the standard Luftwaffe tactic, diving through the fighter screen at high speed, ignoring the escorts, trying to reach the bombers. The P-51s followed him down, caught him at 15,000 feet, forced him into a turning fight. Steinhoff was flying a Fuselage, an excellent aircraft at low altitude, but the P-51 turned with him, stayed on his tail, fired repeatedly. Steinhoff escaped only by diving to the treetops and running at maximum speed. He landed with bullet holes in his rudder and elevator. He told his ground crew, "That Mustang followed me all the way down and stayed with me in the turn. I couldn't shake him. We can't outturn them, we can't outdive them, and they can fly farther than we can. I don't know how we're supposed to beat them." The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was severe. For 3 years they had owned the sky over Germany. They knew that beyond a certain point, American fighter escorts would have to turn back, and the bombers would be vulnerable. That knowledge gave them confidence, allowed them to plan their attacks, to position their formations at exactly the right point to maximize their advantages. Now that advantage was gone. American fighters could be anywhere, at any altitude, at any distance from England. German pilots could no longer predict where the escorts would turn back, because they weren't turning back. The rules had changed. German fighter commanders tried to adapt. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, ordered his pilots to focus on the bombers and ignore the fighters whenever possible. The mission was to stop the bombs, not to achieve a favorable kill ratio against enemy fighters. But that strategy was nearly impossible to execute. The P-51s positioned themselves between the German fighters and the bombers. Any attack on the bombers meant fighting through the escorts first, and fighting P-51s meant casualties. The aircraft was faster than the Bf-109 at altitude, could turn with the FW-190, and was more heavily armed than either. Worse, there were hundreds of them. The Americans seemed to have an unlimited supply. Every mission, more P-51s appeared. The Luftwaffe was outnumbered, outranged, and increasingly outfought. German intelligence tried to determine how the Americans had achieved the range increase. They examined wreckage from downed P-51s, looking for modified fuel systems, enlarged tanks, anything that would explain the impossible range. They found the drop tanks, of course, the 108-gallon paper tanks manufactured by Boatta Scott in Britain. German engineers calculated the additional range provided by the drop tanks and realized the truth. The P-51 had been designed from the beginning with exceptionally large internal fuel capacity. The drop tanks merely extended an already impressive range. There was no secret modification, no revolutionary technology. The Americans had simply built a fighter with enough fuel capacity to escort bombers anywhere in Europe. the Germans had never considered it possible. Their own long-range fighter projects, the Bf-110, the Me-210, had all focused on twin-engine designs. They had assumed a single-engine fighter couldn't carry enough fuel for strategic range. They were wrong. By the end of March 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost over 400 fighter pilots killed or seriously wounded. Most were lost in battles over Germany, fighting against escorted bomber raids. The P-51 had forced the Luftwaffe to fight at a time and place of American choosing, and the casualties were unsustainable. Replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with less than 200 hours total flight time. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages were becoming critical as American bombers destroyed synthetic fuel plants across Germany. Aircraft production was still high, but there weren't enough trained pilots to fly them. Galland reported to Goering that the fighter force was being destroyed. He needed more aircraft, more pilots, more fuel, and most of all, more time to train replacements properly. Goering had no solutions. Hitler demanded that the Luftwaffe stop the bombing raids, but provided no additional resources. The industrial capacity simply didn't exist anymore. The factories were being bombed, the synthetic fuel plants were being destroyed. The transportation system was breaking down, and over all of it, P-51s circled, shooting down any German fighter that tried to interfere. The strategic impact became clear by April 1944. The 8th Air Force had achieved air superiority over most of Germany. Bomber losses dropped from 8% per mission in October 1943 to less than 2% in April 1944. The P-51 was primarily responsible. With continuous fighter escort, bombers could attack any target in daylight with acceptable losses. The Luftwaffe could still inflict casualties, but they couldn't stop the raids. Germany's war production was being systematically destroyed, and there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do about it. In April 1944, 8th Fighter Command expanded operations to include aggressive fighter sweeps ahead of the bomber formations. The P-51s would take off early, fly directly to German airfields, and strafe aircraft on the ground before they could take off to intercept the bombers. The tactic was devastating. German fighters were destroyed on the ground by the dozens. Airfields were cratered, fuel dumps burned, maintenance facilities destroyed. The Luftwaffe was being attacked at its source. The 4th Fighter Group participated in these operations throughout April and May. They strafed airfields across Germany, destroying aircraft on the ground and in the air. The aggressive tactics worked. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing more aircraft on the ground than in the air. The cost was not insignificant. Low-level strafing was dangerous. German airfields were heavily defended with anti-aircraft guns. P-51s were hit regularly. Some were shot down, their pilots killed or captured. But the exchange ratio favored the Americans overwhelmingly. For every P-51 lost, the Germans lost 10 or more aircraft on the ground, plus trained pilots who might have been killed when their aircraft exploded during the strafing run. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe's day fighter force was a shadow of what it had been a year earlier. On D-Day, June 6th, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe managed only 100 sorties over the invasion beaches. The Allies flew over 14,000. German pilots who tried to attack the invasion fleet were shot down immediately by overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Western Europe. The P-51 had made that possible. Without the long-range escort capability, the strategic bombing campaign would have failed. Without the strategic bombing campaign succeeding, air superiority over France would not have been achieved. Without air superiority, the D-Day invasion would have faced catastrophically higher casualties and might have failed entirely. After the war, Hermann Göring was interrogated by American intelligence officers. They asked him what factors had led to Germany's defeat in the air. Göring's answer was direct and documented in official United States Army Air Force's interrogation records. Long-range fighters were the most decisive factor in the air war. He stated that deep bomber penetrations were only possible with long-range escort and that this capability came as a complete surprise to the Luftwaffe. When fighters appeared over Berlin for the first time, Goering admitted he knew the eventual results would be tragic for Germany. The strategic air offensive could continue indefinitely, and the Luftwaffe lacked the resources to stop it. The mechanics who maintained the P-51s rarely received recognition. Their names don't appear in history books, but they worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, keeping the aircraft flying. They changed engines in the rain. They repaired battle damage in freezing temperatures. They loaded ammunition at dawn so the missions could take off on time. Each aircraft required constant maintenance. The Merlin engine needed oil changes every 25 flying hours. Spark plugs fouled and required replacement regularly. The coolant system developed leaks that had to be sealed. The ammunition belts for the 50-caliber machine guns had to be loaded by hand. 6 guns, 1,800 rounds per aircraft. Every single round inspected and loaded into the belts that fed into the wing guns. Drop tanks had to be installed, fuel lines connected, electrical systems tested. Every control surface checked for proper movement, every tire inspected for wear, every hydraulic line examined for leaks. The work never stopped. A typical maintenance shift began at 0400 hours. The mechanics arrived in the dark, used flashlights to conduct pre-flight inspections, started engines to check for oil leaks and unusual sounds, tested magnetos and generators, checked fuel quantities, armed the guns. By 0600, the aircraft had to be ready for the morning mission. If a pilot reported a problem during startup, the mechanics had minutes to diagnose and fix it, or the mission would be delayed. Delays meant bombers flew without escorts. Bombers without escorts meant dead crews. The mechanics understood the stakes. They worked fast, worked accurately, double-checked everything. After the aircraft took off, the mechanics cleaned up, inventoried spare parts, prepared for the inevitable repairs that would be needed when the aircraft returned. Battle damage was common. 20mm cannon shells punched holes through aluminum skin. Machine gun bullets hit control surfaces, hydraulic lines, fuel tanks. Some damage could be patched quickly. Aluminum sheets riveted over holes, control cables replaced, hydraulic lines repaired. Serious damage meant removing entire assemblies, wings, tail sections, engines, replacing them with spares if available, or cannibalizing parts from aircraft too damaged to repair. The mechanics became experts at improvisation, at making repairs with whatever materials were available, at keeping aircraft flying when by all engineering logic they should have been grounded. These crew chiefs worked in teams, each responsible for a specific aircraft and its pilot. They took pride in their work, knowing that mechanical failures could mean the difference between a pilot returning home or being lost over enemy territory. The ground crews at Debden worked continuously throughout 1944, maintaining the 4th Fighter Group's aircraft through thousands of combat missions. The long-range escort capability of the P-51 changed the fundamental strategic equation of the air war. Before the Mustang, unescorted bombers couldn't survive over Germany. After the Mustang, bombers could reach any target in Europe in D2 daylight with acceptable losses. That capability allowed the combined bomber offensive to succeed, which in turn made the D-Day invasion possible. The P-51's range made air superiority achievable, and air superiority made victory inevitable. The aircraft proved that range was more important than raw performance, that the ability to fly to the target was more valuable than the ability to fly slightly faster or turn slightly tighter. The lessons influenced aircraft design for decades. Long range became a design priority. Every modern fighter aircraft emphasizes combat radius as a critical specification. The lineage traces directly back to the P-51. Colonel Blakeslee flew until October 1944, when he was grounded by direct order from 8th Fighter Command. He had accumulated over 1,000 combat hours, more than any American pilot in the war, and headquarters couldn't risk losing him. Blakeslee was devastated. He wanted to keep flying, to keep fighting, to be with his pilots until the war ended. But the order was final. He returned to the United States in November. The 4th Fighter Group continued fighting without him, adding to their total until they became the highest-scoring American fighter group in the European theatre, with over 1,000 confirmed aerial victories. Blakeslee stayed in the Air Force, commanded a fighter wing in Korea, and retired as a colonel in 1965. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross twice, the Silver Star twice, the Distinguished Flying Cross 7 times, and numerous other decorations. He never sought publicity for his accomplishments. When asked about the Berlin missions years later, he simply said, "We did what needed to be done." The P-51s continued escorting bombers until the last missions of the war in May 1945. By then, the Luftwaffe barely existed. Fuel shortages were so severe that many German fighters couldn't take off. The pilots who did fly were mostly inexperienced replacements, killed on their first or second missions by American pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience. The air war was over. The P-51 had won it, not through superior speed or firepower, but through the simple ability to be there, to fly far enough to escort bombers to any target and bring them home again. In 1944, the Senate War Investigating Committee, chaired by Senator Harry Truman, called the P-51 the most aerodynamically perfect pursuit plane in existence. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, called the appearance of the Mustang over Germany one of the great miracles of the war. General Karl Spaatz, commander of United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, stated clearly that without the P-51, the strategic air offensive could not have succeeded. The bomber crews expressed it more simply. They called the P-51s little friends. When those silver fighters appeared on escort duty, bomber crews knew they had a chance to survive the mission. The presence of Mustangs meant hope. Wars are won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. The P-51 succeeded because thousands of individuals made it work. Pilots who flew 6-hour missions knowing one mistake meant death. Mechanics who worked through exhaustion keeping aircraft flying. Engineers who designed systems that functioned reliably under combat stress. Intelligence officers who planned routes that maximized range while minimizing risk. Factory workers who built 18,000 Mustangs in 3 years. Test pilots who proved the aircraft's capabilities. Instructors who trained replacement pilots. Everyone contributed to a system that, in the end, changed the outcome of the war. On March 6, 1944, Blakeslee didn't know he was making history. He was doing his job, protecting bombers, trying to keep his pilots alive. The fact that he was accomplishing what German intelligence said was impossible didn't matter in the moment. He saw enemy fighters, engaged them, defended the bombers, returned home. The historical significance only became clear later when analysts examined the data and realized what had happened. The Americans had solved the range problem. The escorts could go anywhere. The Luftwaffe had nowhere to hide. The strategic bombing campaign could continue until Germany's industrial capacity was destroyed. Air superiority was assured. The invasion could proceed. Victory became possible. For the German pilots who saw P-51s over Berlin that day, the implications were immediate. They understood instantly that the war had shifted. American fighters were flying deeper into Germany than should have been possible. The escorts weren't turning back anymore. Every target was now vulnerable to daylight attack. The Luftwaffe would have to defend everywhere at once, spreading their diminishing forces across an impossibly wide front. They would be fighting at the end of long supply lines, with inadequate fuel, with poorly trained pilots, against an enemy with numerical superiority and unlimited resources. The mathematics were clear. The Luftwaffe was being ground down through attrition, and there was no way to stop it. When those silver Mustangs appeared over the Nazi capital, circling at 30,000 feet, untouchable and unopposed, the outcome of the air war became certain. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to stay connected with history that matters. These stories shaped the world we live in today, and we would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from. Our community reaches across continents. connecting people who understand that history isn't just dates and names in textbooks. History is people making choices, taking risks, doing difficult things because they believed it mattered. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.